Welcome back, everybody, to the School Leadership Show. This is Mike Dowdy, and with me, as always, is co-host and summarizer extraordinaire, Jen David Lang. Hi, Jen.
Thanks for the generous intro. Hi, Mike.
And joining us today, we have Joe Jones and TJ Very, who are the authors of Candid and Compassionate Feedback, Transforming Everyday Practices in Schools. So I got to tell you, gentlemen, I've been looking forward to this conversation. I was an elementary school principal for 10 years, and I was reading through Jen's summary, and I'm like, oh man, did I fall into the niceness trap? And we're going to get into that in a second. But if you could, maybe Joe, could you start off and tell folks a little bit about your background?
Yes, thank you, Michael, Jen. Great to be on the show. I started out as a social studies high school teacher over 2 decades ago, found myself into administration really through the encouragement of my supervisor at the time. And from there, my career just continued on from assistant principal to principal. I was a principal of a career and technical high school for 7 years. And then I actually found myself as director of assessment and accountability after that, which was a lot different and very unique. And then from there, I became the superintendent of currently where I still am today is Newcastle County VOTEC. So it's been a wonderful career so far, spanning over 2 decades, and each area has really built to where we are now. And then from there, TJ and I just connected years ago, and together we were really focused on improving one another, and really just that blossomed into the Schoolhouse 302.
Very cool. Thank you. And TJ, a little bit about your background.
Sure thing. And again, thanks for having us on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a similar background to Joe's. I was actually a transplant. I was a restaurant manager for a short period of time after I graduated from college, and then found myself training managers and realized that I was teaching people and had a bit of a higher calling. So I went to work in a high school as an English teacher and worked in vocational school district where I could kind of marry some of the skills I was learning in the business world with what kids needed in the English classroom. Spent a number of years working in the city, became a department chair at a pretty large high school. Always wanted to be a high school principal. Didn't do that though. Actually went into administration at the middle school level and fell in love with it. Great time as an assistant principal in a middle school. Became the principal of that same middle school. I'm working in a district called Appoquinimink School District in Delaware. It's one of the fastest growing schools. I always tell people on earth. We grew 600 kids just last year, which afforded the district the opportunity to go to a second assistant superintendent about 7 years ago. And I took that role on. So I oversee now, I have been in this role for 7 years with the district, and I oversee the secondary schools and also the district operations. It's a pleasure to serve this district, and wonderful opportunities that I've had here so far.
Very cool. And something you don't often hear, somebody having a great time as a middle school assistant principal. So it takes a special person to be in middle school. TJ,
I was an ornery kid, and I love ornery kids. So, I can't find a kid ornery enough. Tell you the truth.
And I'll tell you, I'm so thrilled to, your background's in vocational education, career and technical education. I think I'd like to have a conversation about that sometime, because I think that doesn't get enough attention. And I work at a BOCES, which is kind of the sort of, you guys, does Delaware really have an equivalent to that superstructure on top of districts, or not really?
Not that I'm familiar with.
Yeah. So that's part of our bread and butter is career and tech. So all right. So let's get into the book here.
Maybe they have to write the book about career vocational tech so we can talk about it.
I would love it. I think, yeah, like go on forever about that, but I won't get on the soapbox. So let's talk about this book. So Candid and Compassionate Feedback, Transforming Everyday Practice in Schools. Why this book right now? What was the impetus behind this? And it's a couple years ago you wrote it, right?
Yeah, I can start off and then TJ can jump in. We were actually going to just a statewide event. We're both educators in Delaware, and the beautiful thing about Delaware is it's a small sandbox. You can pretty much drive the state in 90 minutes. So some people's commute is our entire state. So, we were going to this event, and TJ had bounced some ideas off. And like I said, one thing that we always try to do was talk about work, where a lot of people will avoid talking about work. We wanted to try to solve some issues, obviously respectful of each other's districts and so on. But it's hard. These are hard jobs, tough decisions, and you get caught up in a lot of different situations where it's nice to get a fresh thought on a particular issue. And so we're talking about sometimes people holding back. How do you break away from people holding back and not saying what needs to be said? So we went from that being offensive to some degree to having a lack of trust to some degree, to how do you build an environment, a culture where people can say, you know what, this is what we want to discuss. This is what needs to be discussed. And then it took on a life of its own as we started saying, all right, well, what are we really talking about here? So we know people hold back. We don't want them to hold back. How do we start figuring out why they're holding back? What's the impact on the organization when they do so? And then what could we even do about it? Like, all right, so great. We identify this issue. What are we going to do about it? And so from there, we kept having these conversations and talking about, we can actually be candid, be direct. It doesn't mean rude. And in fact, it's a form of compassion done well, done right. And that's what we try to really emphasize. But we also found that some people are caught and they're trapped. And TJ can definitely spend a little more time on that circle of nice and that trap.
Before we move forward to that, I just want to move back for a second. I love that you've written a book about the need for school leaders to be more honest and candid in their feedback, because I think that's not even a topic many people are talking about. But I'm curious, and maybe TJ, you can answer this because you've been in different fields. Do you think that the lack of honest feedback or the culture of nice is more pronounced in the education field? Do we have more of a problem with this than other professions?
I think we do, but only because, and Joe and I say this all the time, it's not on purpose. You get into this business because you're altruistic and you want to help people. And that means that you typically, quote unquote, want to be nice. You want to be liked, and we feel like that's the way that we will have influence. We just wrote a blog recently about tips for bad tips about trust, and the thing about building, like quote unquote, building relationships first. And we say that's just not a great tip for a leader. It's better to build a relationship through the work than to think you're going to build a relationship with somebody and then you're going to tell them that they're doing something wrong. And so it's a natural thing in education to fall into this trap of nice. And we also don't always have the clearest bottom lines. We talk about student achievement, but if you own a small butcher shop and somebody's messing up on the front lines and you just lost a customer today, your feedback's going to get pretty candid because your livelihood has been affected. That's not necessarily true day in and day out in education, although we would argue that we are saving lives. And the reason to be candid is to make sure we're doing the best we can at that. But I have found, yes, that I think education, altruistic, culture of nice, and then we're not really talking about the things that we should be.
Well, and I think it's fascinating too that you both have this career in tech background, because that sort of when I think about those fields. So, TJ, you worked in restaurants. I grew up in a restaurant. My dad owned one, and the feedback in the kitchen's pretty direct when something's not right. And I wonder how much of that has sort of influenced your thinking around your approach.
It certainly has. I mean, when I got to education, and I told Joe this all the time when we would do what we call write and runs, was like people aren't talking about what we should be talking about, like being in the room and saying, well, but wait a second, or reading, even as I got, grew up in the field and became an administrator, reading the feedback that people are providing and saying, I don't even know what you're saying here. Number one, I don't know what we're trying to say. And so that we also need to do a better job with that. And Joe and I are trying to influence the field in that regard too. Sometimes it's just not having the training in how to give feedback. Even when we look at walkthroughs, evaluation systems, some of that stuff comes through in the book. We typically train people on the process, but not the social construct and the behavioral psychology behind providing meaningful and quality feedback to improve our practices. And that's why we called the book Transforming Everyday Practice in Schools, because without candor, without the ability to give proper feedback and meaningful feedback, nothing changes. Doesn't matter what you implement, a PLC, a new initiative, a reading strategy, a new instructional practice, nothing changes if we can't be very critical with one another, compassionate as well about how we can improve together.
So let's dive right in then. So talk about the circle of nice. What is that exactly, and why do we fall into this trap?
Yeah, that's the circle of nice is something we landed on just to identify where people typically spend most of their time, especially leaders trying to give feedback, and they don't want to hurt people's feelings. So we get caught in this circle of nice where we're not moving the work forward because we're hesitant to provide the necessary feedback, direction, that's required to achieve whatever we're looking to achieve. And, it's what TJ mentioned earlier. It's not intentional. It is because most of us don't see direct feedback and necessarily conflict in a positive light. And so what we're talking about isn't conflict for the sake of conflict. We're thinking more along the lines of dissonance, where we're sharing ideas, where we're willing to challenge the status quo. But I think that's what happens also when we move through the ranks. A lot of educators become administrators because they were great in the classroom. Well, the skills that made you great in the classroom don't necessarily parlay into becoming great administrators or knowing how to have tough conversations with other faculty, especially when they've been around the block for a while. I can tell you my first assistant principal job, I was 27 years old on the first day. And now that I look back, I think, wow, but on the very first day, I had a gentleman come down the steps, come into my office, hand me a coffee cup. And it was a used coffee cup. And he said, I just want you to know this mug is older than you. So he had no problem being direct with me. And you learn quick that people in the end, once you move out of that circle of nice and into a space of what we call integrity, that you're driven by your vision, mission, and core values, that people know that is what you're always going to anchor your decisions on. I think once you move towards that, people appreciate it. They know where you're coming from. They know why you're driving towards a certain goal. And we also like to think, and we can expand on this more if needed, we never give some of our very best people the feedback that they deserve. And because we already think they're good. When we're saying about candid and compassionate feedback, that's even making our best even better. So it's not just dealing. We tend to think, oh, those that need it. That's not what we're saying here. We're saying this is a culture that always is built on the fact that everybody can get better, and we're willing to have those tough conversations.
I just wanted to say one analogy that I liked a lot. And so for anybody who's listening, who's thinking, oh, that sounds all good, but that wouldn't fly in my school, or I'm not going to do that. Think about this analogy, right? If your doctor weren't honest with you about a diagnosis, right? First of all, that would undermine your trust in the doctor. And certainly then you couldn't there's no matchup with an appropriate treatment. So I like that analogy you use as a way of thinking about it's being honest and candid for a purpose, to move teaching forward. So I like that analogy.
And Jen, you're spot on. We've used that before. The last thing anybody wants is a doctor who's not willing to tell you what's going on. Now, they've been criticized for not having bedside manner, which is why we want the compassion piece. We need people to leave an administrator's office, especially if it's corrective in nature, that they feel equipped to go ahead and implement what's been suggested. That's the compassion piece. That's the support part of all of this. But yeah, it's spot on. And I agree, you have to be able to onboard your school community to this. This isn't just one day being direct when you've never been direct. That is not, and TJ can definitely talk about that more. It is letting people know, hey, we're moving into this space and here's why.
And
Yeah,
so yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say that's a shift that we do talk about in the book. We even have, some advice about how you can start to use some language around, we're going to move to a more candid environment. We're going to move to being more direct with one another. And it just was a reminder too, when you asked the question about, do you find this to be a problem in education and maybe not some other fields? For certain, it's a problem everywhere because human beings like to avoid conflict. But when we studied where it worked best, we looked at places like Bridgewater and Associates, where Ray Dalio has talked about principles and being candid, Kimball Scott and radical candor, Pixar and the brain trust. So we really tried to study outside of education where candor was working at its best to prove excellence. And so we hope that shines through in the book as well.
Can you talk a little bit more about that approach to sort of enculturating the organization into this way of, or this approach?
Yeah, so there's 3 places. We broke the book up into 3 distinct environments where candor is necessary. The first, and I mentioned it, teacher evaluation, walkthroughs, just the observational nature of education and the need to be candid with one another if we're going to improve our practices. The second is anywhere where a shared decision is being made. We have found this culture of PLCing and shared decision and delegation. In some cases, it's gone so far that we're not making decisions at all. Right. And so that's a problem. And the third that's near and dear to our hearts is about leadership. We say teacher leaders, and Joe and I tout the fact that teacher leaders are really the only way you're going to drive improvements in schools. But it's hard to say teacher leader and not build the capacity of that person. And one way we build the capacity of that person is by giving them candid and compassionate feedback. So if we have teacher leaders in our school, we always say that if 30 to 50% of the time you spend with those folks is not about leadership itself, the rest of the time is a waste, right? So you talked about how do you kind of shift into this? It's in those 3 spaces, starting to say, I'm going to be very direct here. I'm going to make sure that I want you to know that I'm going to be direct and I want you to be direct with me. It's accepting feedback as much as it is giving feedback. Because what we're talking about is a culture, not just the boss going around and saying what they think.
Well, and I think too, it sort of locks in that shared purpose or that shared vision of moving forward. I'm going to be direct because I care about you as a professional and I want you to grow. And it's important for our mission as a school. So interesting. Now, the book itself is, and you can tell you both are practitioners because the approach is case studies, right? You want to talk a little bit about, why you chose to go in that direction and sort of the benefits that emerged as a result?
Yeah, we thought the case study approach would resonate with the reader. We want this to be very practical, things that are common within schools that the leader can read, share, discuss with their teams, and then really see the scenarios within their everyday. So these are things we've learned, we've experienced, we've heard through others that we kind of put in the book. what I think makes the book unique, and it's grown even now to the point where we might have to come out with a second edition, are the archetypes. So we have these archetypes, these individuals that we have kind of framed that do things that avoid being candid, where you hurt yourself and really stop or prevent yourself from being candid. Like the osmosis, and some are bizarre, right? But you can really start to find yourself in them. And that's what we tried for this reader. Make no mistake, we all have a little bit of each archetype in us. And so that is where we wanted to really kind of land with the each of the case studies, like, yep, I've done this, but this is how you can avoid it. And we had a lot of fun building those archetypes.
So what are we? Yeah, I got to hear we got to tell people what they are.
I can rattle off a couple and then you can see if you follow up. So people really love the archetypes. They gravitate towards because you can see yourself in them, and they're not like bumbling idiots. I mean, they're not meant to be funny because they're characterized as not smart people or don't get it. They're making a mistake that all of us can fall into if we're not deliberate with our practice and candid feedback, right? So one of them is the ambiguous. This is a person who talks and talks and talks, and you never know what they're saying. So you go to a meeting, the ambiguous is there. At the end of the meeting, you're like, I have no idea what direction we're going in or how we're doing with this project. Joe mentioned the osmosis. I'm most like the osmosis. This is a person who goes and gives directions about something, and just because they noticed a problem and pointed out the problem, they think everybody understands what the problem is and what to do about it, right? They'll hold their backer, right? This is one of the kings of the candid feedback archetypes. This is a person who's thinking something, but doesn't say it out loud. And then we do dive into, in some of the classes that we teach on this, conversational remorse, which is not one of the archetypes, but is something that we all fall into, which is not saying something and then wishing that you said it, or saying something, and this is my problem, saying something and then wishing that you didn't say that, right? And those are all just the psychological aspects of what happens when we're trying to give feedback. And we studied that when we wrote the book in terms of what it feels like to give feedback. It's actually way harder to give good feedback than it is to receive it. And so we're tearing ourselves inside when the other person's like, I want to just know what you're trying to say. And so that's what we hope folks get from the book. Any others? There's 9 of them.
Yeah, the one that I love, and TJ knows this because I think we're all guilty of it, is the easer inner. You know, that's the individual, you know, you want to come in and you're going to have a difficult conversation, you know, and that's one where we teach this. TJ and I are fortunate also to work with new administrators quite often through the state. And that is one that we hit on very often and very early, is don't ease into difficult conversations. If you have to have a difficult conversation, just let the person know it's a difficult conversation. And so that's, you know, Lincoln on leadership, right? That's Lincoln was famous for expressing how he felt about something and the situation he was in as a result of the individual, even if it was a decision of like hiring somebody. And there's like famous letters associated with him, but we can really find ourselves easing in, you know, the compliment sandwich, you know, where you give a compliment, then you lay, and then, so all we're trying to do is avoid the tough stuff there. And what I found, and TJ and I through all our research, is just be direct. Don't sugarcoat it. Let the individual know. And then also let them know you're there for them. That's the compassion piece. We don't spend hours upon hours looking to hire and recruit people, onboard them, only then to say like you're not working and beat them up and then see them go. You know, so this is an effort to really develop people.
I just wanted to say for listeners who haven't looked at the book yet, one of the things that I love about the book is that these archetypes and these scenarios, Joe and TJ don't just describe them, but they they have actual quotes, they have actual language, and it's rare that as leaders we get to hear the language of other leaders. So they show you the language where a leader is trying to, ease in or avoid the genuine feedback, and then they rewrite it and show you the actual language. And if it's okay with TJ and Joe, can I share one of the examples just to give the lead? So, in one example, and this has happened to many of us, right? A principal goes in, observes a teacher, and the teacher is using a practice not backed by research, right? Round robin reading. So, but instead of being candid, the principal says, starts with the questions, so you used round robin reading. I'm curious, is this a consistent strategy you use? But that's not really the question. So instead, Joe and TJ rewrite it with language that is much more candid. And so you can read this in the book and hear that language, right? During the walkthrough, it appeared that students were following along and reading aloud. However, round robin reading can have 3 unintended negative consequences. 1, it limits engagement by students zoning out. 2, it may negatively affect fluency if certain students can't read well. 3, some students may feel embarrassed, refuse to read. If you want to listen to students as they read, partner reading is effective. If you're interested in their fluency and comprehension, choral reading is a good alternative. So you see how that language is so much more specific and honest and genuine, and actually serves the teacher better than some open-ended question where you're not really asking anything. I don't know, did I characterize that correctly?
Absolutely. That's wonderful, Jen. That's a great example too. And I think one thing this book does, and we hope, again, this might be the osmosis as well. It does require the principal, the administrator to be the instructional leader that every school needs. So to be able to rattle that type of research off, you have to be knowledgeable with the trends, what's going on. And it always doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't even have to be individual research. It's just when, for example, even as now a superintendent, when I hear teachers speak who I know are excellent, I listen. I listen to what they're doing. It doesn't have to be me generating the work. If my director of instruction is speaking, I listen. And if I have questions, I ask it. And so I no longer am in that space necessarily to have the time to research that and so on. I'm now in a slightly different space as a superintendent. But I think that's where you become the leader every school deserves and that every kid needs. Just like you want them to have the teacher that really can transform their life, those teachers need an administrator that can help them transform that classroom.
It also brings administrators back to their roots of teaching. And I that shouldn't be lost on what you read out loud, Jen, is that good feedback also teaches the reader. It assumes that the person reading the feedback is also a learner, and it allows them to learn from what you have to share. And it's very descriptive. We've gotten too far away from narrative feedback and just gone to evidence collection, where we should be describing what's happening and then describing what should happen alternatively. And we've also gotten into a culture of asking questions. And in a lot of the research that we did about that, the questions that we ask, especially to our best professionals, can be condescending. And so one of the things that we've taught subsequent to the book is there's 2 reasons not to ask a question. I mean, that's what that leader did in the passage. And those 2 reasons are to lure someone into think what you already know to be true, or to prompt someone into the realization that they could have done something better. Those 2 things are just not fair. And so as we become coaches and we do a better job of that, we also need to do a better job with our professional dialogue and the reasons that we ask questions versus the reasons that we just teach someone to do it differently.
Well, and it's so much more efficient, and on the way to the goal, instead of saying, so tell me how you decided to choose round robin reading as a strategy. Why waste time on the answer to that question if we know it's a bad strategy? Go.
100%.
And Mike, that's powerful, because think about all the professional learning that may have occurred prior to that walkthrough or observation you've been talking about choral reading or some other strategies to really engage, have students summarize, and you didn't see any of it. So yes, cut to the chase. Say we just did X, Y, and Z, and TJ and I teach something called anchor, focus, and align. All feedback should be anchored to the vision and mission, the professional learning, and then focused conversations, and then always bring it back, always aligning to what you're doing. And people then thrive on that type of feedback. And again, we think about our best teachers and what level of feedback do they want. And that's the barometer for gauging what type of conversation that we should have with everyone. Because I've never met an excellent teacher who hasn't said, well, Joe, what'd you think? They're not afraid of the feedback. They're not afraid of it. They want it because they already believe in themselves and what they can do. And the fact that, I take it as, really a vote of confidence that I can help them improve.
So I'm curious now, there's something to be said for, entering an existing culture and shaping it in a way to get toward candor and compassion. How does your view in this affect the way you interview and hire? So I guess the question is, how do you determine when you're interviewing and looking to hire that this person hopefully has the potential to receive this kind of feedback and act on it?
It's a great question, Mike. And a lot of times people ask us, how are your books threaded together? And I know you're not asking this part of the question, but we always say through culture. But we have written a book called Building a Winning Team, and a book that was subsequent to that called Retention for a Change. And in those books, we do address the need to change our hiring practices so that we can bring in the people to the culture who match what we're looking for in someone. And so, just to be simplistic about it is to say this is a interview question. In our culture, we give feedback to our teachers on a weekly basis, and we expect those who work within this culture to not only receive that feedback and respond to it, but to also provide candid feedback to others. How do you feel about that? And I've been a proponent of asking, how do you feel about that as the only interview question? Like, we sent you our core values and the vision of the school in your interview packet. We're certain that you've read through that. How do you feel about that? Can you pick out a core value and explain to us how you would fit in here to the culture of our school? And so if we're using candor from our culture, we ought to do it in the interview and then let somebody say, look, I'm coming here because I'm craving feedback. And I heard that this school is all about feedback and I want to grow as an educator, and nobody's been in my room in the last 7 years. And so those are the kind of people we want to attract.
And there's certain people you want to repel. And sometimes the answer to that question helps. That's great.
Yeah,
so go ahead.
Real quick on that, Mike, I would say we almost touched the surface, right? This is where we just got to get better. Like, we ask somebody, well, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? If you go around to ask 100 administrators how valuable those questions are, to a T, they'll tell you, I probably don't get what I really need from that. But if you ask somebody, what are your weaknesses? And now describe the feedback you would give yourself. That'll give insight into how reflective they are. That'll lead you to understand the type of conversations they're having with themselves or the level of conversations they've had in the past. So we almost get there with some of our questions, but we do have to be a little more sophisticated and say, all right, well, am I really going to get to the heart of what I want to know? I don't want to know people's strengths and weaknesses because most people struggle on what they are. They Google it and then they memorize a couple. I'm not saying that from personal experience.
My favorite. I work too hard.
Yeah.
Give me a break.
Yeah.
Well, I want to be sensitive to your time, gentlemen. And
Can I ask a burning question?
You may ask one burning question.
I know
Jen.
this is running over. Well, first of all, I love that you connected it, Mike, to the interview. And honestly, I'd rather hire a teacher who had fewer strengths but was willing to have feedback and grow than a teacher who's stronger but not interested in the feedback growth piece. But I know we try to keep it shorter, but a burning question that I think all leaders listening to this are having, because we're right in the middle of still a pandemic, and the questions I'm hearing are, how can I go observe teachers and give feedback when, I've never seen educators so burnt out, right? And how can I focus on this? Shouldn't I be focusing on teachers' mental health, personal health, physical health? Like, how can I do this now? Is the question I'm getting. If we're okay, Mike, for just one more.
It's a really good question, Jen. I'll kick us off, and then I'm sure Joe has a bunch of thoughts on it as well. I would say the first is, do not forget that and we teach this as one of the primary concepts. The first most powerful piece of feedback that you can give anybody is praise. So we tend to think of feedback as critical, but praise instills pride in our work, and it demonstrates what we should repeat next time. And we have a model for praise. It starts with a praise statement. That's number one. We want our folks to be very specific about what they saw. Number three, that we want them to provide a rationale for why that's so important. And we want to close the loop with more praise, another praise statement. And we can go around doing that. I don't care how bad the pandemic gets. Our teachers need to hear what they're doing well, and we need to be better at it, right? And that takes practice. We had a statistic that we were teaching the other night that 70% of people don't feel that they're praised, but 70% of leaders feel like they give praise. So what's that tell you? It tells you that we go around thinking we're praising people, but we're not doing it all that well. So we need to do it better, and we need to do it often. So that's one answer. And then number two, I double down on informal. If you don't feel like, you're going to go in and we're going to document teacher, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think we need to be doing instructional leadership and find ourselves in the most important space in our schools, which is the classroom. But we should be informal whenever we can, so that people feel like, hey, this is a growth environment, and I'm not always going to get, quote unquote, dinged and documented for doing something wrong, especially when we're all dealing with a crisis. I hope that helps listeners, but go with praise. Joe, anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely, Jen. It's a wonderful question. And I would like to broaden. Remember, we're discussing the entire culture of the school. And the candor isn't just the leader being candid. Right now, a great culture of candor and compassion would be a two-way street. It's also, in a PLC, willingly putting all the issues on the table and then hashing them out one at a time, and having teachers willingly say what's going on versus, feeling upset, holding it in, being disgruntled. And trust me, no culture is perfect. I want to make sure that's abundantly clear. I mean, even in our own organizations, this is stuff we're striving to achieve. This is something we're working to embrace and do. But one thing I've talked to all my administrators about this year is I want personal human connections. Personal human connections. Go out and about, talk to people, see how they are. Ask them directly how they're doing. If something is off, you still need to address it. We're still expecting students to learn, and we're still expecting students to show up. And last thing we want to do is pull back at the disservice of some of the most important parts of what our kids do each and every day. But it's an environment where people can really have those honest conversations, not hold back, and feel like they're not also going to be criticized or that the leader's vindictive afterwards. It just has to be done right. And that's why we try to stress that candor is not rude. It's not that. Candor is about having those tough conversations and willingly discussing those tough things.
So I could not agree more. And I wonder as part of this. So let's say the culture is it's getting to where you want it to be. Yeah, a lot of a preponderance of the teachers are good with the compassionate and candid feedback. Do you see I guess a translation of that? So a teacher who is really good at accepting that kind of feedback from an administrator who's really good at giving it, does that then translate into the teacher getting better at giving feedback to his or her students? Have you found that to be the case?
We've also, yes, 100%. We've also found it to be the case where when teacher leaders get quality and meaningful feedback, they're able to translate that in a way that is compassionate to their peers. And so that's why, we say feedback is king, because it drives the culture from the inside out. It's a willingness to accept and give feedback, and it translates to improvements in practice and ultimately student achievement.
But great way to end. TJ Very and Joe Jones. The book is, I want to make sure I get the title exactly right, Candid and Compassionate Feedback, Transforming Everyday Practice in Schools. Gentlemen, I could have this conversation all afternoon. So where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
TJ?
Thanks, Joe. You can find us at the schoolhouse302.com. We write blog posts on the long form blog. We have a One Thing series podcast, so we interview guests, some recent, pretty big names in education, always helping leaders to lead better and grow faster. We have another podcast called Focus Ed that's done in a live audience here in Delaware. And we recommend books every month on our site. And then we also have a 302 Thoughts that anybody's welcome to come to. It's a live event once a month that we publish, and that's at the schoolhouse302.com.
And we'll make sure we link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much, gentlemen. This is what a great conversation. And thank you, Jen, for co-hosting as usual. And we really appreciate the time.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. A lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.